welcome to Classics Cut. Today, we're going to skip a little bit of the introduction because this book really doesn't need one. It was famous back when it was published. It brought pirate craze then. Every once in a while, it pops back into pop culture again and brings pirates back around to being that fun little adventure. And we felt it was the perfect little chaser for last week's fun little adventure. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. And if you'd be thinking I'd be doing an accent this time, you're wrong, because I get tired of doing that. It hurts the voice. One of the others here who actually trained in stuff like that will probably do something like that. But anyways, Chapter 1. The Old Sea Dog and the Admiral Benbow. Squire Trelawney, Dr. Livingston, the rest of these gentlemen, having asked me to write down the whole particulars about Treasure Island from the beginning to the end, keeping nothing back but the bearings of the island, and that only because there is still treasure yet to be lifted, I take up my pen in the grace of year of our Lord 17, and go back to the time when my father kept Admiral Benbow in, and the brown old seaman with the saber cut first took up his lodgings under our roof. I remember him as it was yesterday, as he came plodding to the inn door, his sea chest following behind him in a hand barrow, a tall, strong, having nut-brown man with a tarry pigtail flying over his shoulders of his soiled blue coat, his hands ragged and scarred, with black broken nails and a saber cut across one cheek, a dirty, livid white. I remember him looking round the cove and whistling to himself as he did so, and then breaking out that old sea song that he sang so often afterwards, 15 men on a dead man's chest, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum, in a high, old, tottering voice that seemed to have been turned and broken at caps and bars. Then he rapped on the door with a bit of a stick like a handspike that he carried, and when my father appeared, called roughly for a glass of rum. This, when it was brought to him, he drank slowly, like a connoisseur, lingering on the taste, and still looking about him and the cliffs and up at our signboard. "This is a handy cove," he says at length, "and a pleasant city, a grog shop. Much company, mate?" My father told him no, very little company, and more was the pity. "Well then," he said, "this is the berth for me. Here you, matey." He carried to the man who trundled in the barrow. "Bring up alongside, help with my chest. I'll stay here a bit," he continued. "I'm a plain man. Rum and bacon and eggs is what I want. And that head up there for the watch of the ship's off. What might you call you? You might call me Captain. Oh, I see where you're at. There." He threw down 3 or 4 gold pieces on the threshold. "You can tell me when I've worked through that," he says, looking as fierce as a commander. And indeed, bad as his clothes were, and coarsely as he spoke, he had none of the appearance of a man who sailed before the mast, but seemed like a mate or skipper accustomed to being obeyed or to strike. The man who had came with the barrow told us the mail had sent him down the morning before at Royal George, that he had inquired what inns there were along the coast, and hearing ours was well spoken of, I suppose, and described as lonely, he chose it from the others for his place of residence. And that's all we could learn from our guest. He was a very silent man by custom. All day he hung around the cove or upon the cliffs, the brass telescope. All evening he sat in a corner of the parlor next to the fire and drank rum and water very strong. Mostly he would not speak when spoken to, only look up sudden and fierce and blow through his nose like a foghorn. And we and the people who came about our house soon learned to let him be. Every day when he came back from his stroll, he would ask if any seafaring men had gone by along the road. At first we thought it was a want for company, or of his own kind, that made him ask this question, but at last we began to see he was desirous to avoid them. When a seaman put up at the Admiral Benbow, now and then some did, making by the coast road for Bristol, he would look in at him high throughout the curtained window before he entered the parlor, and he was always sure to be as silent as a mouse when any such was present. For me, at least, there was no secret about this matter, for I was, in a way, a sharer in his alarms. He had taken me aside one day and had promised me a silver fourpenny on the first of every month if I were to only keep my weathered eye open for a seafaring man with one leg, and let him know the moment he appeared. Often enough, when the first of the month came around and I applied to him for my wage, he would only blow through his nose, look at me, and stare down. But before the week was out, he was sure to think better of it, bring me my fourpenny piece, and repeat his order to look out for a seafaring man with one leg. How that personage haunted my dreams, I need scarcely tell you. On stormy nights when the wind shook the four corners of the house and the surf roared along the cove and up the cliffs, I would see him in 1,000 forms, and without 1,000 diabolical expressions. Then the leg would be cut off at the knee, now at the hip. Now it was a monstrous kind of creature who had never had but one leg, and that in the middle of his body. To see him leap and run and pursue me over the hedge and ditch was the worst of the nightmares. And altogether, I paid pretty dear for my monthly fourpenny piece, in the shape of these abominable fancies. But though I was terrified by the idea of the seafaring man with one leg, I was far less afraid of the captain himself than anybody else who knew him. There were nights when he took a deal more rum and water than his head would carry, and then he would sometimes sit and sing his wicked old sea songs, minding nobody, but sometimes he would call for glasses round and force all the trembling company to listen to his stories or bear chorus to his singing. Often I heard the house shaking with yo-ho-ho and a bottle of rum, all the neighbors joining in for dear life with a fear of death upon them, and each singing louder than the others to avoid remark. For in these fits he was the most overriding companion ever known. He would slap his hand on the table for silence all around, and would fly to a passion of anger at a question, or sometimes because none was put, so he judged the company was not following his story. Nor would he allow anyone to leave the inn till he had drunk himself sleepy and reeled off to bed. His stories were what frightened people worst of all. Dreadful stories they were, about hanging and walking the plank, and storms at sea, and the dry Tortugas, and the wild deeds and places on the Spanish Main. By his own account, he must have lived his life among some of the wickedest men that God has ever allowed upon the sea. And the language in which he told these stories shocked our plain country people almost as much as the crimes as he described. My father was always saying the inn would be ruined, for people would soon cease coming there to be tyrannized over and put down and sent shivering to their beds, but I really believe his presence did us good. People were frightened at the time, but on looking back, they rather liked it. It was a fine excitement in a quiet country life. There was even a party of younger men who pretended to admire him, calling him a true sea dog and a real old salt, and such names, saying they're a sort of man that made England terrible at sea. In one way, indeed, he bade fair to ruin us, for he had kept on staying week after week, and at last month after month, so that all the money had been long exhausted, and still my father never plucked up the heart to insist on having more. If he ever mentioned it, the captain blew through his nose so loudly you might call it a roar, and started my poor father out of the room. I have seen him wringing his hands after such a rebuff, and I am always sure the annoyance of the terror he lived in must have greatly hastened his early and unhappy death. All the time he lived with us, the captain made no change whatsoever in his dress but to buy some stockings from a hawker. One of the cocks of his hat having fallen down, he let it hang there from that day forth, though it was a great annoyance whenever it blew. I remember the appearance of his coat, which he had patched himself upstairs in his room, and which, before the end, was nothing but patches. He never wrote or received a letter, he never spoke with any but the neighbors, and with these, for the most part, only when drunk on rum. The great sea chest none of us had ever seen open. He was only once cross, and that was towards the end, when my forefather was far gone in decline, that took him off. Dr. Livesey came one day to see the patient, took a bit of dinner from my mother, and went into the parlor to smoke a pipe until his horse should come down from the hamlet. For we had no stabling at the old Benbow. I followed him in. I remember observing the contrast of the neat, bright doctor, with his powder and white snow, and his bright black eyes and pleasant manners, made with the coltish country folk, and above all, with that filthy, heavy, bleared scarecrow of a pirate of ours, sitting far gone in rum, with his arms on the table. Suddenly, the captain, that is, began to pipe up his eternal song, 15 men on the dead men. Anyone want to join?
Click. All right.
I wasn't expecting that.
Yes,
sorry.
when you hit song, then we all join in.
Okay. Sounds good.
The captain, that is, began to pipe up his eternal song,
15 men on the dead man's chest, yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum. Drink and the devil had done for the rest, yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum.
At first I had supposed the dead man's chest to be the identical big box in his upstairs in the front room, and thought that had been mingled into my nightmares with that of the one-legged seafaring man. But by this time we had all long ceased to pay any particular notice to the song. It was new that night to nobody but Dr. Livesey, and on him I observed it did not produce an agreeable effect, for he looked up for a moment quite angrily before he went on with his talk to old Taylor, the gardener, on a new cure for rheumatics. In the meantime, the captain gradually brined up at his own music, and at last flapped his hand upon the table before him in a way we all knew to mean silence. The voices stopped at once, all but Dr. Livesey. He went on as before, speaking clear and kind, drawing briskly at his pipe between every two words. The captain glared at him for a while, flapped his hand again, glared at it still harder, and at last broke out with a villainous low oath, "Silence there, between decks." "Were you addressing me, sir?" says the doctor, when the ruffian had told him, with another oath. "Though so, I have only one thing to say to you, sir," replies the doctor. "If you keep on drinking rum, the world will soon be quit of a very dirty scoundrel." The old fellow's fury was awful. He sprang to his feet, drew and opened a sailor's clasp knife, and bouncing it open on the palm of his hand, threatened to pin the doctor to the wall. The doctor never so much as moved. He spoke to him as before, with his shoulder in the same tone of voice, rather high, so that the room might hear, but perfectly calm and steady. "If you do not put that knife that instant in your pocket, I promise upon my honor you shall hang at the next assizes." Then followed a battle of looks between them, but the captain soon knuckled under, put his weapon away, and resumed his seat, grumbling like a beaten dog. "And now, sir," continued the doctor, "since I now know there's such a fellow in my district, you may count I'll have an eye upon you day and night. I'm not a doctor only, I'm a magistrate, and if I catch a breath of complaint against you, if it's only for a piece of incivility like tonight's, I'll take effectual means that have you hunted down and routed out for this. Let that suffice." Soon after, Dr. Livesey's horse came to the door, and he rode away, but the captain held his peace that evening, and for many evenings to come.
Chapter 2. Black Dog appears and disappears. It was not very long after this that there occurred the first of the mysterious events that rid us last of the captain, though not, as you will see, of his affairs. It was a bitter cold winter, with long hard frosts and heavy gales, and it was plain from the first that my poor father was little likely to see the spring. He sank daily, and my father and my mother and I had all the inn upon our hands, and were kept busy enough without paying much regard to our unpleasant guest. It was one January morning, very early, a pinching, frosty morning, the cove all grey with hoarfrost, the ripple lapping softly on the stones, the sun still low and only touching the hilltops and shining far to seaward. The captain had risen earlier than usual and sat down the beach, his cutlass swinging under the broad skirt of the old blue coat, his brass telescope under his arm, his hat tilted back upon his head. I remember his breath hanging like smoke in his wake as he strode off, and the last sound I heard from him as he turned the big rock was a loud snort of indignation, as though his mind was still running on Dr. Livesey. Well, Mother was upstairs with Father, and I was laying the breakfast table against the captain's return when the parlour door opened and a man stepped in on whom I had never set my eyes before. He was a pale, tallowy creature, wanting 2 fingers of the left hand, and though he wore a cutlass, he did not look much like a fighter. I had always my eye open for seafaring men, with one leg or two, and I remember this one puzzled me. He was not sailorly, and yet he had the smack of the sea about him too. I asked him what it was for his service, and he said he would take rum, but as I was going out of the room to fetch it, he sat down upon the table and motioned me to draw near. I paused where I was, with my napkin in my hand. "Come here, sonny," says he. "Come here." I took a step nearer. "Is this here table for me mate Bill?" he asked with a kind of leer. I told him I did not know his mate Bill, and this was for a person who stayed in our house and we called the captain. "Well," said he, "my mate Bill would be called the captain as like as not. He has a cut on one cheek and a mighty pleasant way with him, particularly in drink, is my mate Bill. We'll put it for argument's sake that your captain has a cut on one cheek, and we'll put it, if you like, that that cheek's the right one. Ah, well, I told you. Now is my mate Bill in this here house?" I told him he was out walking. "Which way, sonny? Which way is he gone?" And when I pointed out the rock and told him how the captain was likely to return and how soon, and asked him a few more questions, "Ah," said he, "this'll be as good a place to drink to my mate Bill." The expression of his face as he said these words was not at all pleasant, and I had my own reasons for thinking that the stranger was mistaken, even supposing he meant what he said. But this was no affair of mine, I thought, and besides, it was difficult to know what to do. The stranger kept hanging around just inside the inn door, peering around the corner like a cat waiting for a mouse. Once I stepped out myself into the road, but he immediately called me back, and as I did not obey quick enough for his taste, his fancy, a most horrible change came over his tallowy face, and he ordered me back in with an oath that made me jump. As soon as I was back in, he returned to his former manner, half warning, half sneering, patted me on the shoulder, told me I was a good boy, and he had taken quite a fancy to me. "I have a son of my own," said he, "and as like as you is two blocks, and he's all the pride of me heart. But the great thing for boys is discipline, sonny, discipline. Now, if you'd have sailed along with Bill, you wouldn't have stood there to be spoke to twice, not you. That was never Bill's way, nor the way of Sitches who was sailing with him. And here, sure enough, is me mate Bill, with a spyglass under his arm, bless his old heart, to be sure. You and me'll just go back into the parlour, sonny, and get behind the door, and we'll give Bill a little surprise. Bless his heart, I say again." So saying, the stranger backed along with me into the parlour and put me behind him into the corner so that we were both hidden by the open door. I was very uneasy and alarmed, as you may fancy, and it took rather added to my fears to observe that the stranger was certainly frightened himself. He cleared the hilt of his cutlass and loosened the blade in his sheath, and all the while we were waiting there, he kept swallowing as if he felt what we used to call a lump in the throat. At last, in strode the captain, slammed the door behind him without looking to the right or left, and marched straight across the room to where his breakfast awaited him. "Bill," said the stranger in a voice that I thought he had tried to make big and bold. The captain spun on his heel in front of us. All the brown had gone out of his face, and even his nose was blue. He had the look of a man who sees a ghost, or the evil one, or something worse. And for if anything can be, and upon my word, I felt so sorry to see him all in a moment turn some old and sick. "Come, Bill, you know me. You know an old shipmate, Bill, surely," said the stranger. The captain made a sort of gasp. "Black dog," said he. "And who else?" returned the other, getting more at his ease. "Black dog as ever was, come to see his old shipmate Billy at the Emerald Benbow Inn. Ah, Bill, we have seen a sight of times, us two, since I lost him 2 talons," holding up his mutilated hand. "Now look here," said the captain. "You've run me down. Here I am. Well, then speak up. What is it?" "That's you, Bill," returned the black dog. "You're in the right of it, Billy. I'll have a glass of rum from this dear child here, as I take such a liking to, and we'll sit down, if you please, and talk square, like old shipmates." When I returned with the rum, they were already seated on either side of the captain's breakfast table. Black dog next to the door and sitting sideways as to have one eye on his old shipmate and one, as I thought, on his retreat. He bade me go and leave the door wide open. "None of your keyholes for me, sonny," he said, and I left them together and returned into the bar. For a long time, though I certainly did my best to listen, I could hear nothing but a low gabbling, but at last the voices began to grow higher, and I could pick up a word or two, mostly oaths, from the captain. No, and an end of it," he cried once. "And again, if it comes to swinging, swing all, I say." Then all of a sudden there was a tremendous explosion of oaths and 2 other noises. The chair and the table went over in a lump, a clash of steel followed, and then a cry of pain. And in the next instant I saw Black Dog in full flight and the captain hotly pursuing, both with drawn cutlasses, and the former streaming blood from the left shoulder. Just at the door the captain aimed at the fugitive one last tremendous cut, which certainly would have split him to the chine had it not been intercepted by a big signboard of Admiral Benbow. You may see the notch on the lower side of the frame to this day. That blow was the last of the battle. Once out upon the road, Black Dog, in spite of his wound, showed a wonderful clean pair of heels and disappeared over the hedge of the hill in just a minute. The captain, for his part, stood staring at the signboard like a bewildered man. Then he passed his hand over his eyes several times and at last turned back into the house. Jim, says he, rum. And as he spoke, he reeled a little and caught himself with one hand against the wall. Are you hurt? Said I.
Rum, he repeated. I must get away from here. Rum, rum.
I ran to fetch it, but I was quite unsteady by all that had fallen out, and I broke one glass and found the tap. And when I was still getting in my own way, I heard a loud fall in the parlour, and running in, beheld the captain lying full length upon the floor. At the same instant, my mother, alarmed by the cries and fighting, came running downstairs to help me. Between us, we raised his head. He was breathing very loud and hard, but his eyes were closed, and his face a horrible colour. Dear, dearie me, cried my mother. What a disgrace upon the house! And your poor father sick! In the meantime, we had no idea what to do to help the captain, nor any other thought but that he had got his death hurt in the struggle with the stranger. I got the rum, to be sure, and tried to force it down his throat, but his teeth were tightly shut, and his jaw was as strong as iron. It was a happy relief for us when the door opened and Dr. Livesey came in on his visit to my father. Oh, doctor, we cried, what shall we do? Where is he wounded? Wounded? A fiddlestick's in, said the doctor. No more wounded than you or I. The man has had a stroke, as I warned him. Now, Mrs. Hawkins, just you run upstairs to your husband and tell him, if possible, nothing about it. For my part, I must do my best to save this fellow's trebly worthless life. Jim, you get me a basin. When I got back with the basin, the doctor had already ripped up the captain's sleeve and exposed his great sinewy arm. It was tattooed in several places. Here's luck, a fair wind, and Billy Bones's fancy were very neatly and clearly executed on the forearm, and up near the shoulder there was a sketch of a gallows and a man hanging from it, done, as I thought, with great spirit. Prophetic, said the doctor, touching this picture with his finger. And now, Master Billy Bones, if that be your name, we'll have a look at the colour of your blood. Jim, he said, are you afraid of blood? No, sir, said I. Well then, he said, you hold the basin. And with that he took his lancet and opened the vein. A great deal of blood was taken before the captain opened his eyes and looked mistily about him. First he recognized the doctor with an unmistakable frown, then his glance fell upon me, and he looked relieved. But suddenly his colour changed, and he tried to raise himself, crying, Where's Black Dog? There is no black dog here, said the doctor, except what you have been on your own back. You have been drinking rum. You have had a stroke precisely as I told you, and I have just, very much against my own will, dragged you head foremost out of the grave. Now, Mr. Bones.
That's not my name,
he interrupted. Much I care, returned the doctor. It's the name of a buccaneer of my acquaintance, and I call you it for the sake of shortness. And what I have to say to you is this. One glass of rum won't kill you, but if you take one, you'll take another, and I'll stake my wig if you don't break off short. You'll die. Do you understand that? Die, and go to your own place, like the man in the Bible. Come now, make an effort. I'll help you to your bed for once. Between us, with much trouble, we managed to hoist him upstairs and laid him on his back, whereupon his head fell back on the pillow as if he were almost fainting. Now, mind you, said the doctor, I clear my conscience. The name of rum for you is death. And with that he went off to see my father, taking me with him by the arm. This is nothing, he said, as soon as he had closed the door. I have drawn blood enough to keep him quite a while. He should lie for a week where he is. That is the best thing for him and you, but another stroke would settle him.
Chapter 3. The Black Spot. About noon, we stopped at the captain's door with some cooling drinks and medicines. He was lying very much as we had left him, only a little higher, and he seemed both weak and excited. Jim, he said, you're the only one here that's worth anything, and you know I've always been good to you. Never a month but I've given you a silver fourpenny for yourself, and now you see, mate, I'm pretty low and deserted by all. And Jim, you'll bring me one noggin of rum now, won't you, mate? The doctor, I began, but he broke in cursing. The doctor, in a feeble voice, but heartily. Doctors is all swabs, he said. And that doctor there, why, what do he know about seafaring men? I've been in places hard as pitch and mates dropping round with yellow jack, and the blessed land a heaving like the sea with earthquakes. What does the doctor know of lands like that? And I lived on rum, I tell you. It's been meat and drink and man and wife to me. And if I'm not to have my rum, I'm a poor old hulk on a lee shore. My blood'll be on you, Jim, and that Dr. Swab. And he ran on again for a while with curses. Look, Jim, how my fingers fidge. He continued in the bleeding tone. I can't keep 'em still, not I. I haven't had a drop this blessed day. The doctor's a fool. I tell you, if I don't have a drain of rum, Jim, I'll have the horrors. I seen 'em all. Already. I seen old Flint in the corner there behind you. Plain as print, I seen him. And if I get the horrors, I'm a man has lived rough, and I'll raise Cain. Your doctor himself had said 1 glass wouldn't hurt me. I'll give you a golden guinea for a noggin, Jim. He was growing more and more excited, and this alarmed me for my father, who was very low that day and needed quiet. Besides, I was reassured by the doctor's words now quoted to me, and rather offended by the offer of a bribe. I want none of your money, I said, but what you do owe my father. I'll get you 1 glass and no more. When I brought it to him, he seized it greedily and drank it out. Aye, aye, he said. That's some better, sure enough. And now, matey, did that doctor say how long I was to lie in this old breath? A week at least, said I. Thunder, he cried. A week? I can't do that. They'd have the black spot on me by then. The lubbers is going about to get the wind of me this blessed moment. Lubbers as couldn't keep what they got and want to nail what is another's. Is that seemingly behavior now, I want to know? But I'm a saving soul. I never wasted good money of mine, nor lost it neither, and I'll trick 'em out again. I'm not afraid on 'em. I'll shake out another reef, matey, and tattle 'em again. As he was thus speaking, he had risen from bed with great difficulty, holding on to my shoulder with a grip that almost made me cry out, and moving his legs like so much dead weight. His words, spirited as they were in meaning, contrasted sadly with the weakness of the voice in which they were uttered. He paused when he got into a seated position on the edge. The doctor's done me in, he murmured. My ears be singing. Lay me back. Before I could do much to help him, he had fallen back again in his former place, where he lay for a silent while. Jim, he said at length, you saw that seafaring man today? Black Dog, I asked. Ah, Black Dog. He's a bad one. But there's worse that put him on. Now if I can't get away nohow, and they tip me the black spot, mind you, it's my old sea chest thereafter. You get on a horse. You can, can't you? Well then, you get on a horse and go yes I will, to that eternal Dr. Swab, and tell him to pipe all hands, magistrates and such, and he'll lay 'em aboard the Admiral Benbow. All Flint's crew, man and boy on all of 'em, that's left. I was first mate. I was old Flint's first mate, and I'm the only one who knows the place. He gave it to me at Savannah, where he lay a-dying like as if I was now, you see. But you won't poach unless they get the black spot on me, or unless you see that Black Dog again, or a seafaring man with 1 leg, Jim. Him above all. But what is the black spot, Captain? I asked. That's a summons, mate. I tell you if they get that. But you keep your weather eye open, Jim, and I'll share with you equal details of my honor. He wanted a little longer, his voice growing weaker, but soon after I had given him his medicine, which he took like a child, with the remark, if a seaman ever wanted drugs, it's me. He fell at last into a heavy, swoon-like sleep, at which I left him. What I should have done, had all gone well, I do not know. Probably I should have told the whole story to the doctor, for I was in mortal fear lest the captain should repent of his confessions and make an end of me. But as things fell out, my poor father died quite suddenly that evening, which put all other matters on one side. Our natural distress, the visits of the neighbors, the arranging of the funeral, and all the work of the inn be carried on in such meanwhile, kept me so busy that I scarcely time to think of the captain, far less be afraid of him. He got downstairs the next morning, to be sure, and had his meals as usual, though he ate little and had more, I am afraid, than his usual supply of rum, for he helped himself out of the bar, scowling and blowing through his nose, and no one dared cross him. On the night before the funeral, he was as drunk as ever, and it was shocking in that house of mourning to hear him singing away at his ugly old sea-song. But weak as he was, we were all in the fear of death for him, and the doctor was suddenly taken up with a case many miles away, and was never near the house after my father's death. I have said the captain was weak, and indeed he seemed rather to grow weaker than regain his strength. He clambered up and down the stairs, and went from the parlour to the bar and back again, and sometimes put his nose out of doors to smell the sea, holding on to the walls as he went for support, and breathing hard and fast like a man on a steep mountain. He never particularly addressed me, and it was my belief he had good as forgotten his confidences, but his temper was more flighty, and allowing for his bodily weakness, more violent than ever. He had an alarming way now, when he was drunk, of drawing his cutlass and laying it bare before him on the table. But with all that said, he minded people less, and seemed shut up in his own thoughts, and rather wandering. Once, for instance, to our extreme wonder, he piped up to a different air, a kind of country love song that he must have learned in his youth, before he began to follow the sea. So things passed until the day after the funeral, and about 3 o'clock of a bitter, foggy, frosty afternoon, he was standing at the door for a moment, full of sad thoughts about my father, when I saw someone drawing slowly near along the road. He was plainly blind, for he tapped before him with a stick, and wore a great green shade over his eyes and nose. He was hunched, as if with age or weakness, and wore a huge old tattered sea cloak with a hood that made him appear positively deformed. I had never in my life saw a more dreadful looking figure. He stopped a little from the inn, and raised his voice in an old sing-song, addressing the air in front of him. "Will any kind friend inform a poor blind man, who has lost the precious sight of his eyes in the gracious defence of the native country, England, and God bless King George, where or in what part of this country he may now be?" "You are at the Admiral Benbow, Black Hill Cove, my good man," said I. "I hear a voice," he said. "A young man. Will you give me your hand, my kind young friend, and lead me in?" I held out my hand, and the horrible, soft-spoken, eyeless creature gripped it in a moment like a vice. I was so much startled that I struggled to withdraw, but the blind man pulled me close to him with a single action of his arm. "Now, boy," he said, "take me to the captain." "Sir," I said, "upon my word I dare not." "Oh, that's it. Take me in straight, or I'll break your arm." And he gave it, as he spoke, a wrench that made me cry out. "Sir," I said, "it is for yourself, I mean. The captain is not what he used to be. He sits with a drawn cutlass, another gentleman—" "Come now, March," he interrupted. "And I never heard a voice so cruel and cold and ugly as that blind man's. It cowed me more than the pain, and I began to obey him at once, walking straight in at the door and towards the parlour where our sick old buccaneer was sitting dazed with rum. The blind man clung close to me, holding me in one iron fist and leaning almost more of his weight on me than I could carry. Lead me straight to him, and when I'm in view, cry out, 'Here's a friend for you, Bill!' If you don't, I'll do this." And with that he gave me a twitch, and I thought that would have made me faint. Between this and that, I was so utterly terrified of the blind beggar that I forgot my terror of the captain, and as I opened the parlour door, I cried out the words as he had ordered, in a trembling voice. The poor captain raised his eyes, and at one look the rum went out of him, and left him staring sober. The expression of his face was not so much of terror as of mortal sickness. He made a movement to raise, but I do not believe he had enough force left in his body. "Now, Bill, sit where you are," said the beggar. "If I can't see, I can hear a finger stirring. Business is business. Hold out your left hand. Boy, take his left hand by the wrist and bring it near to my right." We both obeyed him to the letter, and I saw him pass something from the hollow of the hand that held his stick into the palm of the captain's, which closed upon it instantly. "And now that's done," said the blind man, and at the words he suddenly left hold of me, and with incredible accuracy and nimbleness skipped out of the parlor and into the road, where, as I still stood motionless, I could hear his stick go tap, tap, tapping into the distance. It was some time before either I or the captain seemed to gather our senses, but at length, and about at the same moment, I released his wrist, which I was still holding, and he drew in his hand and looked sharply into the palm. 10 o'clock, he cried. 10 o'clock! 6 hours! We'll do them yet! And he sprang to his feet. Even as he did so, he reeled, put his hand to his throat, stood swaying for a moment, and then, with a peculiar sound, fell from his whole height face foremost to the floor. I ran to him at once, calling to my mother, but haste was all in vain. The captain had been struck dead by a thundering apoplexy. It is a curious thing to understand. Certainly never liked the man, though of late I had begun to pity him. But as soon as I saw that he was dead, I burst into a flood of tears. It was the second death I had known. The sorrow of the first was still fresh in my heart.
Chapter 4. The Sea Chest. I lost no time, of course, in telling my mother all that I knew, and perhaps should have told her long before, and we saw ourselves at once in a difficult and dangerous position. Some of the man's money, if he had any, was certainly due to us, but it was not likely that our captain's shipmates, above all the two specimens seen by me, Black Dog and the Blind Beggar, would be inclined to give up their booty in payment of the dead man's debts. The captain's order to mount at once and ride for Dr. Livesey would have left my mother alone and unprotected, which was not to be thought of. Indeed, it seemed impossible for either of us to remain much longer in the house. The fall of coals in the kitchen grate, the very ticking of the clock, filled us with alarms. The neighborhood, to our ears, seemed haunted by approaching footsteps. And what between the dead body of the captain on the parlor floor and the thought of that detestable blind beggar hovering near at hand and ready to return, there were moments when, as the saying goes, I jumped in my skin for terror. Something must speedily be resolved upon, and it occurred to us that at last to go forth together and seek help in the neighboring hamlet. No sooner said than done. Bareheaded as we were, we ran out at once in the gathering evening and the frosty fog. The hamlet lay not many 100 yards away, though out of view, on the other side of the next cove, and what greatly encouraged me, it was in an opposite direction from that whence the blind man had made his appearance, and whither he had presumably returned. We were not many minutes on the road, though we sometimes stopped to lay hold of each other and hearken. But there was no unusual sound, nothing but the low wash of the ripple and the croaking of the inmates of the wood. It was already candlelight when we reached the hamlet, and I shall never forget how much I was cheered to see the yellow shine of doors and windows. But that, as it proved, was the best of the help we were likely to get in that quarter, for you would have thought men would have been ashamed of themselves. No soul would consent to return with us to the Admiral Benbow. The more we told her of troubles, the more, man, woman, and child, they clung to their shelter in the houses. The name of Captain Flint, though it was strange to me, was well enough known to some there, and carried a great weight of terror. Some of the men who had been to field work on the far side of the Admiral Benbow remembered, besides, to have seen several strangers on the road, and taking them to be smugglers, to have bolted away, and one, at least, had seen a little lugger in what we called Kit's Hole. For that matter, anyone who was a comrade of the captain's was enough to frighten them to death. And the short and the long of the matter was that while we could get several who were willing enough to ride to Dr. Livesey's, which lay in another direction, not one would help us to defend the inn. They say cowardice is infectious, but then argument is, on the other hand, a great emboldener, and so when each had said his say, my mother made them a speech. She would not, she declared, lose money that belonged to her fatherless boy. If none of the rest of you dare, she said, Jim and I dare. Back we will go, the way we came, and small thanks to you, hulking, chicken-hearted men. We'll have the chest open, if we die for it. And I'll thank you for that bag, Mrs. Crossley, to bring back our lawful money in. Of course, I said I would go with my mother, and of course they all cried out at our foolhardiness. But even then, not a man would go along with us. All they would do was to give me a loaded pistol lest we were attacked, and to promise to have horses ready saddled in case we were pursued on our return, while one lad was to ride forward to the doctors in search of armed assistance. My heart was beating finally when we two set forth in the cold night upon this dangerous venture. A full moon was beginning to rise and peered readily through the upper edges of the fog, and this increased our haste, for it was plain, before we came forth again, all that would be as bright as day, and our departure exposed to the eyes of any watchers. We slipped along the hedges, noiseless and swift, nor did we see or hear anything to increase our terrors, till, to our relief, the door of the Admiral Benbow had closed behind us. I slipped to bolt at once, and we stood and panted for a moment in the dark, alone in the house with the dead captain's body. Then my mother got a candle in the bar, and holding each other's hands, we advanced into the parlor. He lay as we had left him, on his back, with his eyes open and one arm stretched out. "Draw down the blind, Jim," whispered my mother. "They might come and watch outside. And now," said she, when I had done so, "we have to get the key off that. And who's to touch it? I should like to know." And she gave a kind of sob as she said the words. I went down on my knees at once. On the floor, close to his hands, where was a little round of paper, blackened on one side. I could not doubt that this was the black spot, and taking it up, I found written on the other side, in a very good, clear hand, this short message: "You have till 10 tonight." "He had till 10, mother," said I, and just as I said it, our old clock began striking. This sudden noise startled us shockingly, but the news was good, for it was only 6. "Now, Jim," she said, "that key." I felt in his pockets, one after another. A few small coins, a thimble, and some thread and needles. A piece of pigtail, tobacco, bitten away at the end. His gully with the crooked handle, a pocket compass, and a tinder box were all they contained, and I began to despair. "Perhaps it's round his neck," suggested my mother. Overcoming a strong repugnance, I tore open his shirt at the neck, and there, sure enough, hanging to a tiny bit of terry string, which I cut with his own gully, we found the key. At this triumph we were filled with hope and hurried upstairs without delay to the little room where he had slept so long, and where his box had stood since the day of his arrival. It was like any other seaman's chest on the outside, the initial B burned on the top of it with a hot iron, and the corners somewhat smashed and broken as by long rough usage. "Give me the key," said my mother, and though the lock was very stiff, she had turned it and thrown back the lid in a twinkle. A strong smell of tobacco and tar rose from the interior, but nothing was to be seen on the top except a suit of very good clothes, carefully brushed and folded. They had never been worn, my mother said. Under that, the miscellany began: a quadrant, a tin cannikin, several sticks of tobacco, 2 brace of very handsome pistols, a piece of bar silver, an old Spanish watch, and some other trinkets of little value and mostly of foreign make, a pair of compasses mounted with brass, and 5 or 6 curious West Indian shells. I have often wondered since why he should have carried all these shells with him in his wandering, guilty, and hunted life. In the meantime, we had found nothing of any value but the silver and the trinkets, and neither of these were in our way. Underneath there was an old black boat coat, whitened with a sea salt on many a harbor bar. My mother pulled it up with impatience, and there lay before us the last things in the chest: a bundle tied up in oilcloth, and looking like papers, a canvas bag that gave forth, at a touch, the jingle of gold. "I'll show these rogues that I'm an honest woman," said my mother. "I'll have my dues, and not a farthing over. Hold Mrs. Crossley's bag." And she began to count over the amount of captain's scores, from the sailor's bag into the one that I was holding. It was a long, difficult business, for the coins were of all countries and sizes, doubloons, and louis d'ors, and guineas, and pieces of 8, and I know not what besides, all shaken together at random. The guineas, too, were about the scarcest, and it was with these only that my mother knew how to make her count. When we were about halfway through, I suddenly put my hand upon her arm, for I had heard in the silent frosty air a sound that brought my heart into my mouth. the tap-tapping of the blind man's stick upon the frozen road. It drew nearer and nearer, while we sat holding our breath. Then it struck sharp on the inn door, and then we could hear the handle being turned and the bolt rattling as the wretched being tried to enter. And then there was a long time of silence, both within and without. At last the tapping recommenced, and to our indescribable joy and gratitude, died slowly away again until it ceased to be heard. "Mother," said I, "take the hold and let's be going." For I was sure the bolted door must have seemed suspicious and would bring the whole hornet's nest about our ears. Though how thankful I was that I had bolted it. None could tell who had never met that terrible blind man. But my mother, frightened as she was, could not consent to take a fraction more than was due to her, and was obstinately unwilling to be content with less. It was not yet 7, she said, by a long way. She knew her rights and she would have them, and she was still arguing with me when a little low whistle sounded a good way off upon the hill. That was enough, and more than enough, for both of us. "I'll take what I have," she said, jumping to her feet. "And I'll take this to square the count," I said, picking up the oilskin packet. Next moment we were both groping downstairs, leaving the candle by the empty chest, and the next we had opened the door and were in a full retreat. We had not started a moment too soon. The fog was rapidly dispersing. Already the moon shone quite clear on the high ground on either side, and it was only in the exact bottom of the dell and round the tavern door that a thin veil still hung unbroken to conceal the first steps of our escape. Far less than halfway to the hamlet, very little beyond the bottom of the hill, we must come forth into the moonlight. Nor was this all, for the sound of several footsteps running came already to our ears, and as we looked back in their direction, a light tossing to and fro and still rapidly advancing showed that one of the newcomers carried a lantern. "My dear," said my mother suddenly, "take the money and run on. I'm going to faint." This was certainly the end for both of us, I thought. How I cursed the cowardice of the neighbors, how I blamed my poor mother for her honesty and her greed, for her past foolhardiness and present weakness. We were just at the little bridge, by good fortune, and I helped her, tottering as she was, to the edge of the bank, where sure enough she gave a sigh and fell on my shoulder. I do not know how I found the strength to do it at all, and I am afraid that it was roughly done, but I managed to drag her down the bank and a little way under the arch. Farther I could not move her, for the bridge was too low to let me do more than crawl below it. So there we had to stay, my mother almost entirely exposed, and both of us within earshot of the inn.
Chapter 5, The Last of the Blind Man. My curiosity, in a sense, was stronger than my fear, for I could not remain where I was, but crept back to the bank again, whence, sheltering my head behind a bush of broom, I might command the road before our door. I was scarcely in a position ere my enemies began to arrive, 7 or 8 of them, running hard, their feet beating out of time along the road, and the man with the lantern some paces in front. 3 men ran together, hand in hand, and I made out, even through the mist, that the middle man of the trio was the blind beggar. The next moment his voice showed me that I was right. "Down with the door," he cried. "Aye, aye, sir," ordered either 2 or 3, and a rush was made upon the Admiral Benbow, the lantern-bearer following, and then I could see them pause, and hear speeches passed in a lower key, as if they were surprised to find the door open. But the pause was brief, for the blind man again issued his commands. His voice sounded louder and higher, as if he were afire with eagerness and rage. In, he shouted, and cursed them for their delay. 4 or 5 of them obeyed at once, 2 remaining on the road with their formidable beggar. There was a pause, then a cry of surprise, and then a voice shouting from the house, "Bill's dead!" But the blind man swore at them again for their delay. "Search him! Some of you shirking lubbers, and the rest of you aloft, get the chest," he cried. I could hear their feet rattling up our old stairs, so that the house must have shook with it. Promptly afterwards, fresh sounds of astonishment arose. The window of the captain's room was thrown open with a slam and a jingle of broken glass, and a man leaned out into the moonlight, head and shoulders, and addressed the blind beggar on the road below him. "Phew!" he cried. "They've been before us. Someone's turned the chest out aloft. Is it there, Board Pew?" "The money's there." The blind man cursed the money. "Flint's fist, I mean," he cried. "We don't see it here nohow," returned the old man. "Here you below there, is it on Bill?" cried the blind man again. At that, another fellow, probably him who had remained below to search the captain's body, came to the door of the inn. "Bill's been overhauled already," he said. "Nothing left." "It's these people at the inn. It's that boy. I wish I had put his eye out," cried the blind man. "Pew!" They were here in no time ago. They had the door bolted when I tried it. Scattered lads and find them. Sure enough, they left their glim here, said the fellow from the window. "Scatter and find them. Rout the house out," reiterated Pew, striking his stick upon the road. Then there followed a great to-do through all our old inn. Heavy feet pounding to and fro, furniture thrown over doors, kicked in, until the very rocks re-echoed, and the men came out again, one after another, on the road, and declared that we were nowhere to be found. And just then, the same whistle that had alarmed my mother and myself over the dead captain's money was once more clearly audible through the night, but this time twice repeated. I had thought it to be the blind man's trumpet, so to speak, summoning his crew to the assault, but I now found that it was a signal from the hillsides toward the hamlet, and from its effect upon the buccaneers, a signal to warn them of approaching danger. "There's Dirk again," said one. "Twice. We'll have to budge, mates." "Budge, you skulk," cried Pew. "Dirk was a fool and a coward from the first. You wouldn't mind him. They must be close by." "They can't be far. You have your hands on it. Scatter and look for them, dogs." "Oh, shiver my soul," he cried. "If I had eyes." This appeal seemed to have produced some effect, for two of the fellows began to look here and there among the lumber, but half-heartedly, I thought, and with half an eye to their own danger all the time, while the rest stood irresolute on the road. "You have your hands on thousands, you fool, and you hang a leg? You'd be as rich as kings if you could find it, and you know it's here, and you stand there skulking? There wasn't one of you dared face Bill, and I did it, a blind man, and I'm to lose my chance for you. I'm to be a poor, crawling beggar, sponging for rum when I might be rolling in a coach. If you had the pluck of a weevil and a biscuit, would you catch them still?" "Hang it, Pew, we've got the doubloons," grumbled one. "They might have hid the blessed thing," and said another. "Take the Georges, Pew, and don't stand there squalling." Squalling was the word for it. Pew's anger rose so high that the objections till at last. His passion completely taking the upper hand, he struck at them right and left in his blindness, and his stick sounded heavily on more than one. These, in their turn, cursed back at the blind miscreant, threatened him in a horrid terms, and tried in vain to catch the stick and wrest it from his grasp. This quarrel was the saving for us, for while it was still raging, another sound came from the top of the hill on the side of the hamlet. The tramp of horses galloping, almost at the same time a pistol shot. A flash and report came from the hedge side, and that was plainly the last signal of danger, for the buccaneers turned at once and ran, separating in every direction, one seaward along the cove, one slant across the hill, and so on, so that in half a minute not a sign of them remained but Pew. Him they had deserted, whether in sheer panic or out of revenge for his ill words and blows, I know not. But there he remained, blind, tapping up and down the road in a frenzy, and groping and calling for his comrades. Finally, he took the wrong turn and ran a few steps past me, towards the hamlet, crying, "Johnny, Black, Dog, Dirk," and other names. "You won't leave old Pew, mates? Not old Pew!" Just then the noise of horses topped the rise, and 4 or 5 riders came in sight in the moonlight and swept at full gallop down the slope. At this, Pew saw his error, turned with a scream, and ran straight for the ditch, into which he rolled. But he was on his feet again, and a second made another dash, now utterly bewildered, right under the nearest of the coming horses. The rider tried to save him, but in vain. Down went Pew with a cry that rang high into the night, and the 4 hoofs trampled and spurned and passed by. He fell on his side and then gently collapsed upon his face and moved no more. I leaped to my feet and hailed the riders. They were pulling up, at any rate, horrified at the accident, and I soon saw that they were. One tailing out behind the rest was a lad that had gone from the hamlet to Dr. Livesey's. The rest were revenue officials whom he had met along the way, and with whom he had the intelligence to return at once. Some news of the luggers in Kit's Hole had found its way to the supervisor dance, and set him forth at night in our direction. And to that circumstance my mother and I owed our preservation from death. Pew was dead, stone dead. As for my mother, when we had carried her up to the hamlet, a little cold water and salt, and soon brought her back again. And she was none the worse for her terror, though she still continued to deplore the balance of the money. In the meantime, the supervisor rolled on, as fast as he could, to Kit's Hole, but his men had to dismount and grope down to the dingle, leading and sometimes supporting their horses, and in continual fear of ambushes, so it was no great matter for surprise that when they got down to the hole, the lugger was already under way. Though still close by, he hailed her. A voice replied, telling him to keep out of the moonlight, or he would get some lead in him, and at the same time a bullet whistled close by his arm. Soon after, the lugger doubled the point and disappeared. Mr. Dance stood there, as he said, like a fish out of water, and all he could do was to dispatch a man to warn the cutter. And that, said he, is just about as good as nothing. They've got off clean, and there's an end. Only, he added, I'm glad I trod on Master Pew's corns, for by the time he had heard my story, I went back with him to the Admiral Benbow, and you cannot imagine a house in such a state of smash. The very clock had been thrown down by the fellows in their furious hunt after my mother and myself, and though nothing had actually been taken away except the captain's money bag and a little silver from the till, I could see at once that we were ruined. Mr. Dance could make nothing of the scene. They got your money, you say? Well then, Hawkins, what in fortune were they after? More money, I suppose? No, sir, not money, I think, replied I. In fact, sir, I believe I have the thing in my breast pocket, and to tell you the truth, I should like to get it put into safety. To be sure, boy, quite right, said he. I'll take it if you like. I thought perhaps Dr. Livesey, I began. Perfectly right, he interrupted, very cheerfully. Perfectly right. A gentleman and a magistrate, and now I come to think of it, I might as well ride around there myself and report to him or squire, Master Pew's dead. When all's done, not that I regret it, but he's dead, you see, and people will make it out against an officer of His Majesty's revenue if make it out they can. Now, I'll tell you, Hawkins, if you like it, I'll take you along. I thanked them heartily for the offer, and we walked back to the hamlet where the horses were. By the time I had told my mother of my purpose, they were all in the saddle. Dogger, said Mr. Dance, you have a good horse. Take up this lad behind you. As soon as I was mounted, holding on to Dogger's belt, the supervisor gave the word, and the party struck out a bouncing trot on the road to Dr. Livesey's house.
Well, folks, it looks like this is going to be about the end of our time together today. This is Treasure Island. We now have lost Blind Pew, and so the story is about to really take a nautical turn. So, if you would like to read the rest for yourself, we have plenty of copies in the system. It's on our digital services as well. Please enjoy. I've been Robert.
I've been Will.
Mike?
Captain Alana.
Hunter. And we're cutting out.